the 6 keys to image quality are going to change your photography. This is one of the things I struggled with the most. And I remember even as an advanced photographer, and I see this a lot of time, I see people talking about it, I see people question it in groups, and what's wrong? Why does this image over here look so sharp and pristine and razor and perfect, and mine don't? Even though I might go in and use a sharpening tool or enhancements, I might use clarity. No matter what I do, you might be thinking sometimes it just doesn't have that zip that I want. I started to really microanalyze and ask questions and search around and figure out what actually is causing my image to lack. I'm going to tell you what the 6 keys are, why they're critical. Some of them I'm sure you know, maybe you know all of them, but I think regardless of your experience level, forming the keys in this way is going to help you keep them here, because if we create frameworks and systems, we work more efficiently. It's just the way our brains work. So the 6 keys to image quality are optic, sensor, exposure, focus, stability, and processing. Stop talking, Gavin. Well, talk, but don't talk. Okay, I started studying things like this, like Hudson River School paintings by Albert Bierstadt, things large. I started studying with my mentor, Ken Whitmire, and Ken taught me the foundations of the fact that we inherited this profession from the painters, and we needed to respect that, and that we were wall art makers. Now, Ken Whitmire's passed away, but I have a lot of stories about me and Ken, not the least of which is the time that we nearly died on Interstate 84 running down to the Oregon coast in the middle of the night because this huge ass elk walked out in front of this tiny little Toyota Yaris, I think it was, that Ken was driving, and we did a 360 on the interstate trying to avoid it. But that's a story that we can come back to. Can I say huge ass elk on YouTube? Because it was a huge ass elk. My goal when I really started studying doing larger quality work was I wanted to take images like this and turn them into things like this. I wanted to do wall art. And so most of the time when I'm making an image for print, I'm thinking in terms of, will this look good in a 40, 50, 60-inch image? Ultimately, whether I'm shooting a little street camera like the X100, or whether I'm pulling out an A7R series, or whether I'm doing fashion photography, whether I'm set up on a tripod, perfectly stable, doing a pristine landscape, or doing a fashion session, knowing these 6 keys will make you make better images. Sometimes people think that because I make a lot of presets and actions and things like that, and I'm always showcasing you those things on this channel, that I'm all about, oh, just take photos and fix them later. That's actually quite the opposite. And in my webinars and workshops, you'll actually find that even though I do a lot of work on post-processing, I talk a great deal about getting it right in camera. The first of the 6 keys, of course, is optic. This is a photo I took a long time ago when I started buying better lens. So this was the old workhorse 70-200 2.8 Canon. Here's the same image taken on a low-cost 24-200. I think it was a Tamron or something like that I paid like $200 for. I'm not saying these other third-party brands don't make good lenses, only that with glass, particularly at long focal lengths and fast apertures that let a lot of light in, the difference is night and day. One looks like I smeared Vaseline on the lens, and the other one looks great at 200 millimeters. And you've seen me over the years talk about my optics, and I will often use actually this lens right here, even on my Sonys that I use today, and that is this Canon 24 millimeter tilt shift. It is a fixed focal length. It is manual focus. It can do tilt and shift, which is cool for perspective on landscapes. It is one of the finest, sharpest lenses I have ever used. Now, sharpness in a lens isn't always the most important. Sometimes I'll come back, and a lot of times when I'm doing fashion sessions, I'll intentionally use the old Fujinon lenses, old Canon FD lenses, things like that. First of all, they give you a creative aesthetic that's amazing if you're doing cinema photography work or if you're doing portraits and fashion, because you don't need every detail of the pour to be flawless. So that's not to say you can't shoot landscapes or that there's none of these old lenses that are very sharp, but a lot of times they tend to have a little more vignetting, they tend to have more aberration, they tend to be a little bit more imperfect, but with that comes a lot of character. But if you take a workhorse lens like the G Master 2.8 16-35, it's known to be a freaking razor sharp lens, and I will put it on my Sony cameras if I'm going out to do a specific landscape, shoot something high res that I know I'm going to be printing really big, commercial work, things like that. But It's not the do-all end-all. It's razor sharp, but with that can come an element of sterility and neutralness. So you kind of got to add the aesthetic into it as you make it. If you take an image like this one shot on my 24mm tilt shift, you can see that on my 40 some odd megapixels of my A7R II, it is pristine. And this prints beautiful and large. On the contrasting side, you take an image like this one that was shot with a little Fuji camera at 24 megapixels on just a 35mm. And it's not that the lens is bad, the lens has character, and especially after an atmospheric processing with Blackroom to get me that really rich shadow and bring this out, you can see that this image, it's not as razor sharp as that last one, but it has its own aesthetic, and the same if we're looking at a portrait. Perfection and sharpness is not the critical thing. In fact, this is a raw file. We need to pull this back and pull back the clarity so that the skin looks more natural and perfect. It doesn't matter if I'm shooting a Sony full frame, if I'm shooting a Fuji crop sensor, if I'm shooting an old 5D Mark II, like this one down in the subway. Not as much resolution, but still really good quality. Again, I think shot on this same lens. Or if I come in and I'm looking at an incredibly high-res scan from a 4x5 that I can just zoom in that's got 100 megapixels of usable detail. This is stuff I could go on more, but I don't want this video to be too long. This topic might actually warrant a webinar of its own. If you guys want to see more classes on the keys of how to improve your image quality, how to know what's going wrong, we'll do more of that. Because when we're finished here today, I'm going to have shown you the 6 keys of image quality so you can look at an image and immediately know what went wrong or what went right. What comes through the lens is important. It's not about having the most expensive lens. It's about having the right lens for what you're doing. And that's why if you want to start budget lenses, I love like the little Fuji Prime lens. I love old vintage lenses that might be manual, but you can still get really great images. A really cheap modern lens that's not very sharp tends to not have that classy character of an old vintage lens. It tends to just look kind of crappy. The next step though is your sensor. What's capturing that image? Now that could be film, even though film technically isn't a sensor, but you could take this image here, shot on a 4x5 sheet of Ektar, and compare it with the actually more known color variant, but the same scene. And it may look like I released an image in 2 ways, but this is actually a different photograph from different cameras, just shot in the same place. But when you zoom in, notice how we're zooming in way further on the left than this 5D Mark II file, which was exposed perfectly using zone principles like I talk about in the exposed workshop and my other videos. And they each have their own aesthetic. But obviously those aren't going to compare to a mobile phone. You know, we talk about taking a mobile camera and, oh, they're getting amazing. You're still using that aspect of the 6 keys. The tiny sensor on a mobile phone will not compete with the Fuji, much less with a full frame sensor. And I could take and make extreme examples like, oh, here's that 5D Mark II file, and here's the same reference photo that I took on an iPhone 4S. Well, obviously, there's absolutely no comparison, but even if we come forward to newer cell phone cameras, this was taken on an iPhone 10 with its zoom lens, you can see that it's really pasty. There's just not great information here, even though technically we could zoom in. And so as cameras get better, even on our cell phones, they become more and more useful tools that can give us good images. But it's important to know what your sensor's capable of. I actually usually put a sticker of the ISO, the base ISOs on the bottom of my camera to remind myself when I grab a particular camera. So if I want to get maximum image quality, I'll, for example, on my A7R II run it at 100 or 640, because each camera actually has its base ISO. Now we could talk about ISO invariance and all that, but that's a whole video in and of itself. Your sensor matters, whether it's the film you choose in a kind of an abstract sense being your sensor, or more likely the camera you're choosing for each situation. I know the best camera is the one you have if you don't have anything else, but I still want to have the best camera. That's why I love this as my compact, because even though it's bigger than a cell phone, I can still keep it in the cup holder in my car, and it still takes really phenomenal images, has an f2 lens, all that good stuff. Another review coming on that. Exposure is the third element in our 6 keys of image quality. If we come into exposure, as we're coming around here, and let's take something like this, all right, your exposure is going to present limitations at times. In this case, I overexposed this a little bit. As you can see, the highlights on her face are kind of harsh, and I actually need to pull back my highlights and my exposure probably a little bit. Realistically, I would go straight to a preset that's going to give me good skin tones, like maybe my Portra 400 in the Filmist collection, and then I would balance my exposure a little bit with it, and maybe the clarity, but the preset did most of the heavy lifting here. Now I can crop it, and sure, I could do burning and dodging, but I've compensated with about a half a stop of exposure. You've seen me talk a lot about zones and knowing your exposure and getting it right in camera. And sometimes when I'm on the go, I don't have time to manually spot meter like I will with a landscape or something like that, like I show you in my metering videos in Exposed. However, if I'm thinking in terms of zones, right? Zone 0 being black, zone 10 being white, thinking about where I want to place my subject in those zones because they do correspond directly to histogram. And zone 5 being middle gray, and that's right in the middle of our histogram. So normally I'm going to want to put skin around zone 6, zone 5, zone 7, depending on the color of the skin, the type of light I'm using. Well, now this was actually not shot on my street camera. This was shot on an A7R II with this crazy sharp Sony lens. Now you can see it's a little bit dark. So in real life, I would come in here and say, well, let's do something like natural HDR and do a preset like night strobe that's going to balance out my shadows and highlights, and it's going to give me more retention, right? And now if I adjust exposure, things are going to be a little more balanced. If I go down here and you look at this, you can see that my exposure has good detail. I can pull back my highlights really well, and I can lift my shadows really well. What it means is that overall my exposure is correct for my subject to balance the supporting cast. Remember, a photo only has one subject. That's not one of the keys to image quality because this is about quality and getting a sharp, clean, crisp, beautiful image. But the photo needs to have one subject. So I'm always going to make my exposure emphasizing for my subject. Then I'm going to build out from there and say, okay, how much light, how much sky, how much shadow? Do I need to adjust anything accordingly? Do I need to put a fill light in? If you put these 6 keys in your mind and then formulate them out in your own way, I guarantee your images are going to improve. So the next is focus. Now, this should be obvious, and we've all been there where a focus is bad. What happens, though, is sometimes people think their camera is not focusing, and really their problem is stability, which goes to shutter speed, whether they used a tripod, whether they were too slow on the shutter speed, etc. So your focus is actually very different. Now, a lot of times, and I'm not afraid to use manual focus lenses even for portraits, because I'll just turn on the focus assist and I'll watch where those things are. Do I miss more shots if I'm on the run doing manual focus? Absolutely. Do I miss more shots if I'm on a tripod carefully doing a landscape with manual focus like this? Not really, because I have detail control. I can zoom in on the back. Focus has come a long way, but back in the day, in the earlier days even of digital, I would oftentimes manual focus on really important things just because even though autofocus was good, you couldn't 100% rely on it. And that's actually still true today. There's times when autofocus still gets confused, so don't be afraid to manual focus. When I present things like manual focusing, it's not about being like, oh, I'm cool, I manual focus. Use whatever technique is best for the image you're making now. But your focus does matter. So if your image is not sharply focused, I'm encompassing depth of field in that focus. And this is a really common problem that you might set it on automatic, right? And your camera is shooting at f8, but you want the background. Focus isn't always everything being sharp. A lot of times, if you're doing an image, you want that focus to be out of focus, right? I want this to be shot at f1.8, which I did on an 85mm Sony here, because I want the background out of focus. So now you come back to, do I shoot wide open? Of course, the wider open we shoot, the more shallow depth of field we get. Or do I shoot f8, f11 because I'm doing a landscape and I want that close? Now we get into talking about hyperfocal distance and all that, because if you crank a lens up to f22, a lot of times you'll actually start losing quality, and the quality will start degrading. Most lenses are going to be ideal more around f11, somewhere in there. So if you turn the aperture too small to get extreme depth of field and make everything, quote, sharp, with a lot of lenses, you actually lose sharpness. So that can be a subtle thing that people are losing image quality because they're not understanding their focus keys, which include not only the optical focus, but how much focus range, depth of field their aperture is giving them. Fifth key in the keys to image quality is your stability. So your stability, I've preached for a lot of times, use a tripod for a long time. And of course, if I'm doing large format things, if I'm doing landscapes, I try to use tripods as much as possible, because almost without fail, if I'm doing something super high res, super sharp that I really want to be great, a tripod is going to help me compose with more detail, which is going to help my overall composition. But that rock solid stability in most cases is going to give me a little better image quality. That said, I know as a real world photographer that sometimes a tripod makes me stiff. And this is something that took me years to figure out too. It's like, no, use a tripod every time. Well, if I'm doing a fashion session with a model or a wedding, sure, if I'm doing the group portraits, I'm going to put it on a tripod because then my framing stays consistent. I can move people within it, and I actually become more flexible. But if I'm doing a session of a model on the street, I'm going to be a lot more flexible with posing and moving if I'm not trying to stay in one place. So I know that by hand holding and doing this, I am, in some images, probably going to lose image quality. So stability is not only about tripod though. Stability is about being aware of your shutter speed. If my shutter speed is not twice as much as my focal length, right? If I'm shooting at 90 millimeters and I have a shutter speed that's under 100th of a second, I know that I'm going to be getting some of those images blurry. I also know that if you shoot a few more, if you have good posture, you hold that up nice and close to your body, that stability will sometimes come out. Let me show you an example of this right here of stability. Here's a handheld shot at a Cheetah's party where they're dancing down here at a party down in Mexico, and they have these masks and they light these fireworks and they're chasing each other around to try and take the firework out of each other's hand as it burns. That's a topic for another day, but regardless, let's actually look, because here's a photo at ISO 1000. This was taken on my RX 100, 23 millimeters, of course, at f2, 1/60th of a second. But people are moving, right? They're chasing each other. But a 60th of a second is too slow when you have this much movement, you're handheld. And yet, some images, there's nothing wrong with their aesthetic being a little bit blurry. But you can see that this one here on the left is a lot blurrier. This little cow firework thing they got going on is much sharper in this, and this is kind of a focal point. So by the time I crop this in and work with it and balance it out with some processing, some presets, I'm going to be going for this being the focal point. What is the difference? They're both shot at a 60th of a second. Well, the difference could be the way you're holding the camera, right? The shutter speed, but the difference could also be their movement. The way that their movement was in relation to where you were, or the slight movement of your camera as you took the photo, can give you a sharp image even in a blurry situation. Just like if you handhold at 20th of a second and you pan with race cars like I used to do at the Speedway, only 20% might be good shots, the rest are blurry. But you nailed the movement right on some of those. So stability isn't 100% of the time about whether you used a tripod. It's understanding that a tripod will make your camera more stable, comparing that with what type of an image you're trying to make, and being aware of your surroundings. Stability is how you hold. Stability is affected by your shutter speed. And all of these things tie into the key that is stability. And the final key in all of this, and something that you guys see me talk a lot about in very subtle pixel peeping detail on this channel, is processing. At the end of the day, you're going to take all these images and you're going to look at what you're trying to create and how you're trying to process the detail. As you come through at the end, your image quality and how you edit that. So I talk a lot about using presets, using actions. I just released the new Naked Darkroom this year, which is textures and borders and these little processing details that give you a finer finish. So processing can include what raw processor you use, whether you shoot raw or JPEG. Obviously, you're going to get more information that you can process with the raw file, but also details like how you finish your image. You remember recently I did a video showing you guys an update in Filmist where I made a really cool preset, my high ISO and low ISO filmic, right? And these are mostly about noise reduction and about grain and adding a little bit of grain in to maintain the detail. So in this image, right, we have artificial light, we have bokeh in the background. So we have our optic, our sensor, our exposure, which encompasses our light, our focus, and what we want to be out of focus, our stability, which in this case is focused on the subject, but isn't worried about the fact that maybe there's a little bit of blowing in the hair and things like that. And then we come into processing, which is what film look or what dynamic range look, what preset, what action, how I'm going to post-process, and all of these elements that come together to make each different type of image, whether it be portrait or fashion, or whether it be a landscape image, balancing out my colors, not oversaturating my greens. The little details that I'm talking about all the time on this channel, and that I'm also making presets and tools, are important. In fact, if you want to see some processing examples, go download my free Filmist mini pack, because you're going to see some very refined examples of processing formulas. And I believe one of those noise reduction presets is in there as well that focus on the details. Sometimes we don't realize how far we've come in processing. If we come back to this image, which is from a Sony camera, this particular one being processed today in Lightroom. And as I showed you, there's quite a bit of latitude here. Obviously though, if you lift your exposure too high, this goes back to our exposure key. And if you are exposing badly and just fixing it in post, you're going to lose quality. You're going to clip highlights, you're going to have more noise. That's why zones and getting the exposure right are important. If you go down to the bottom of Lightroom, you can actually switch the process version and go all the way back to version 1 that we had in the first version of Lightroom. And right now we're in version 5. If I run this same file in version 1 of Lightroom, here's what those shadows looked like. And watch what happens now if I try to push them up. They fall apart so fast and so ugly that the difference is night and day. Watch what happens if I switch to the current process version here. That increase of exposure is much more subtle. There's way less grain. There's way more information being extracted than we had in the version 1, which frankly looked terrible. This isn't to say that Lightroom is absolutely the best processor. We have Capture One users, we have On One users, but if you're taking a raw file and you're processing that to get your best image quality, which you should be in most cases, knowing and being aware of your process, how much you're pushing, how much you're utilizing the keys like exposure, and whether you're having to modify that a lot afterwards, all of these things affect the processing aspect. Each element of the 6 keys to image quality will dramatically affect the way your output comes out. But the key is in knowing all the 6 keys: optic, sensor, exposure, focus, stability, and processing. And those over the past 20 plus years are the keys that I came up with to be essential. They don't define whether your image is artistic, whether you've composed it right, whether you've lit it right. This is a way to simplify the technical aspects. So when you look at an image and you say, you know what, this doesn't look good, it's blurry, there's too much movement, there's weirdness here, there's artifacting here, what went wrong? You can ask yourself, which one of the 6 keys did I miss? Because I can guarantee you that it's going to be one of those 6 keys that you failed at, or that you missed, or that you misunderstood, which isn't to say that every image needs to be perfect. Only that we as image creators, if we understand the things that affect the details, the quality, and the finite nuances of an image, and the more automatic those become, the more we focus on the creative aspects, the light, the art, the emotion. And the more that I have the 6 keys, which are now almost automatic in my brain, the more I actually focus not on the technical details, but on the artistic elements. I hope you found this useful. I hope it wasn't too long. I know the 6 keys can seem a little nerdy, but I promise if you put them to work, they're going to work for you. Let me know if you have questions, leave me a comment, let me know what you thought of this. And I'll put some links to any products or things I mentioned, including the freebies of like Filmist for Lightroom and Capture One, so you can see kind of some of these processing examples I'm talking about and all that good stuff. And of course, you can find all my stuff over at seimfx.com. We'll see you guys next time.